Hello everyone. Today we will be starting chapter 4, which is CSS fundamentals. In this chapter, we will learn how CSS helps us style different web pages, make them visually appealing, and separate design from structure. By the end, you will actually understand how to write CSS rules, apply them to HTML elements, and create cleaner and more attractive websites. So let's start with the chapter 4.1 using CSS in HTML. Up to this point, we have mainly focused on HTML, which gives us the structure of a web page. But now it's time to see how CSS can actually be applied to the structure. In other words, we will learn how to connect the content with the design. In this section, I will walk you through the different ways CSS can be added into an HTML document. We will see inline styles, internal styles, and external styles, each with its own use cases. By the end, you will understand how styling is introduced to web pages and why external CSS is the most common and efficient approach for styling a web page. So let's start with the very basics. What exactly is CSS? CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets, just like HTML is a textual language for structure. CSS is a textual language for styling. In simple terms, CSS tells the browser how things should look, the colors, the fonts, the spacing, the layout, and even how the page will look when printed or displayed on different devices. The acronym CSS itself actually explains two important ideas. The word cascading refers to how multiple style rules can be applied to the same element, and if there's a conflict, the browser follows a set of rules to decide which style wins. The term style sheet means it's a collection of instructions that describe the visual presentation of a structured document, in our case, an HTML page. So, to summarize, HTML gives us the structure and CSS makes it look more presentable. Without CSS, our web page is like raw text in a Word file with no formatting. Everything works, but nothing is visually appealing. CSS is what transforms the plain texts into a polished design. Here is how CSS rules are structured. Developers write CSS as a collection of rules. Each rule has two main parts, a selector and a declaration block inside curly braces. The selector is used to point to specific HTML elements that you want to style. For example, in this case, the selector is span, which means these styles will apply only to the span element. Inside the curly braces, we have the declaration block. This block can have one or more declarations, and each declaration must end with a semicolon. Each declaration is made up of a CSS property and a value. The property describes what you want to change, and the value describes how you want it to look. So, for example, color green means the text um, color will be green, and the font size means the text will be 16 pixels. Now, let's look at how CSS can actually be applied to an HTML page. There are three main ways to do this. The first way is inline style. This means you directly add the style inside an element style attribute. For example, you might write a paragraph style color as red. So this is quick for small changes, but it is actually not ideal for larger projects because it will mix the HTML with CSS. The second way is embedded style sheet. Here you place your CSS rules inside a style element, usually in the head of your HTML document. This keeps the style grouped together but still inside the HTML file. The third and most common way is using an external style sheet. In this case, you create a separate .css file that contains all your CSS rules. Then you link that external CSS document to your HTML using the link element. This is the best practice for larger sites because it keeps structure, HTML, and the presentation for like the CSS separate. One last thing, while style and link elements can technically be placed anywhere, the good practice is to always put them inside your head of the document. This ensures styles are loaded before the page content is displayed. Now, here is an example to compare the three approaches we just discussed. On the left, you see an inline style. The paragraph itself has the style attribute, style color equal to style color is green. As a result, the text shows up in green. In the middle, we have an embedded style sheet. So, inside the style element, we wrote a rule that says the paragraph color should be orange. That means all paragraphs in this HTML document will be orange unless other style overrides it. And finally, on the right side, we see an external style sheet like uh, the HTML uses the link element like here to bring in a separate file, styles.css, like this file. Inside that file, we defined the paragraph color to be purple. So now all the paragraphs across the page or even the whole website will appear in purple. So this example shows how all three methods give the same result, like changing the color of text, but the way we organize and apply CSS makes a big difference in the maintainability of the site. Inline is fine for quick fixes or quick changes. Embedded is good for small pages, but external is best for most of the projects, including the larger ones. Now let's talk about inheritance in CSS. First, remember that every browser has a default style sheet. For example, header 1 element usually appears bold and about twice the normal font size. Even if you don't add any CSS yourself, that's because the browser applies its own built-in default style. But what happens when we add our own CSS? Well, our style declaration overrides the default. So if I say the header 1 color to be blue, the browser no longer decides the color. My CSS takes control. And now here's where the inheritance come in. Style cascade down from parent element to child elements. Imagine you set the body elements font color to be red. That means all text inside the body paragraph heading spans will inherit red text unless a more specific style overrides it. This inheritance continues upward too. Each element inherits from its parent and that parent from its parent, so all the way up to the body element. That's why it's called cascading. The style flow downward through the structure of the page. Now, conflict when two CSS style declarations with the same property apply to the same element, a conflict occurs. CSS has rules to decide which declaration takes priority. One common conflict is between a parent style and a child style. For example, if the parent's element parent element's text is blue, but the child element is set to green, the child's declaration will override the parents. Another common conflict happens between style sheet rules and inline styles. If an embedded or external style sheet sets the text to green, but the element itself has an inline style set to blue, the inline style will take priority and the text will appear blue. Next, let's look at what happens when two style declarations try to control the same element. This situation is called a conflict. The first common case is when a parent style conflicts with a child style. Imagine the parent's element says all text should be blue, but inside it, a child element specifically says the text should be green. Which one wins? The child's declaration overrides the parent's. So the child's text will show as green. The second type of conflict happens when inline style compete with embedded or external style sheets. For example, if an embedded style sheet says the text should be green, but the element itself has an inline style that says it should be blue, which one takes priority? In this case, the inline style wins and the text appears blue. So, the key idea is when there's a conflict, the more specific style takes priority, and parent styles can be overridden by the child styles, and inline styles override the styles written in the style element blocks or external style sheets. Now, here is a practical example of how conflicts between CSS styles are resolved. By default, the browser shows text in black, but in this example, we have added an embedded style sheet. The paragraph selector makes all the paragraph text orange, while the span selector makes all the paragraph text orange. I'm sorry, while the span selector makes span text green. So that's why in the first sentence, the main text is orange, like here, but the span part is green. So here the child span overrides the parent's paragraph color. In the second sentence, the embedded style sheet says text should be orange, but the span has an inline style that sets it to blue. Since inline styles are stronger, the span shows up in blue, overriding the style sheet. So finally, in the third sentence, the paragraph itself has an inline style that makes the whole text red because inline styles override the style sheet rules. This entire line shows in red. So this example neatly demonstrate the cascade browser defaults are overridden by the style sheets and the style sheets are further overridden by inline styles. Now, let's talk about the Chrome Dev tool. We have seen this tool for HTML applications. This is again a very handy feature for developers because it shows exactly which CSS declarations are being applied to each element on a web page. Looking at the screenshot, notice how the span element has an inline style. That's why the word world is showing up in green. The inline style directly applies to it. You can also see how DevTools displays the inheritance of style. The span's green color overrides the parent's paragraph black color and even the body element's red color. So the cascade is clearly visible here. DevTools help us trace which rule finally gets applied. This makes DevTools an essential tool not only for writing CSS but also for debugging when styles don't appear as expected. So that's all for chapter 4.1, and we will see you in the next one.